Okay, let's just dive right in. We've all been there, right? You're watching the news, you see an election poll that shows one candidate is way ahead. But then, election night comes and the results are completely different. It's confusing, it can be really frustrating, and it makes you ask a pretty fundamental question. Why do these polls so often seem to miss the mark?
In this quote, man, it just nails it, right? This was from weeks before the 2020 election, and it just perfectly captures this feeling that so many people have. It's not just a few data nerds who are skeptical. There's this real, growing distrust in the numbers we're constantly being shown. And as it turns out, there's a very, very good reason for that feeling.
So here's the thing. This isn't about one or two polls being slightly off. We're talking about what a lot of experts are now calling a full-blown credibility crisis for the entire polling industry.
Okay, so check this out, because this is where it gets really interesting. After the polls famously missed the mark in 2016, the story was that they'd messed up by underestimating support for Trump among white voters without a college degree. So for 2020, they thought they'd fixed it. They started doing this thing called waiting for education to make sure they had enough of that specific group in their samples. But nope, the errors happened all over again. And that tells you the problem is way deeper than just getting one demographic wrong.
And that leads us to the real elephant in the room, what I like to call the 98% problem. And trust me, this is the key to the whole puzzle.
See, this is the part that totally flips the script. For years, the whole debate about polling has been about who they talk to. Is the sample of people diverse enough? Is it representative? But what if the real problem, the giant, flashing red light, is the massive, and I mean massive, number of people who just flat out refuse to talk to them at all?
Just to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, take a look at this one poll. It's a big one, from the New York Times and Siena College. To get the data they needed, they placed almost 500,000 phone calls. I mean, that is a staggering amount of effort.
So, out of those 500,000 calls, how many people do you think actually picked up, stayed on the line, and finished the entire survey? Just over 4,000. Let that sink in for a second. 500,000 calls to get 4,000 answers.
And there it is. That's the punchline. The response rate is less than 2%. That means for every 100 people a pollster tries to reach, more than 98 of them are telling them in one way or another to get lost. The entire poll, everything you see on the news, is built on the opinions of that tiny, tiny sliver of the population that was willing to talk.
And this brings us to this really key idea in statistics. It's called non-response bias. See, the issue isn't just that the number of people responding is low. The real problem is that the 2% of people who do answer the phone might be fundamentally different from the 98% who don't. They might be more trusting, more politically engaged, or have a totally different worldview.
And we actually have some pretty good evidence for why this happens. Some research points out that voters who are already skeptical of institutions, like the media or universities, are way less likely to participate in a poll. I mean, think about it. If you're someone who already doesn't trust, say, the New York Times, are you really going to spend 20 minutes on the phone with them? Probably not. And if that entire group of people is missing from your data, your results are going to be skewed from the very beginning.
Okay, so if we know that a massive chunk of people aren't talking to pollsters, how in the world do you account for that huge blind spot? Well, that brings us to a concept that will honestly change the way you see every poll from now on: the total margin of error.
Right, we've all seen this. You see it at the bottom of the TV screen. Margin of error plus or minus 3%. It sounds so official, so scientific. But here is the dirty little secret about that number. It's what's called the margin of sampling error. And it only accounts for the uncertainty based on the number of people they did talk to. It completely, totally, 100% ignores the giant uncertainty created by the 98% of people who hung up the phone.
All right, get ready for this, because this slide really puts it all into perspective. On the left, you've got the poll they published. Trump up by 9 with that nice, tidy little 2.8% margin of error. Looks super precise. But then, on the right, look what happens when researchers actually calculated the total margin of error, the one that includes the huge uncertainty from that tiny response rate. Suddenly, the lead shrinks to less than 1 point, and the margin of error just explodes to plus or minus almost 50%. I mean, at that point, the poll is essentially a guess. It's saying the result could be literally anything. And this is a great way to visualize what's happening. That little green line in the middle, that's the margin of error they tell you about. It looks comforting and small, but those big blue bands, that's the reality. That's the real world of uncertainty when you start asking, well, what about the 98% of people we didn't hear from? The more you admit you don't know about them, the wider that cone of uncertainty gets, until the original number looks almost meaningless.
Now, this whole non-response thing, it's the biggest problem for sure. But it's not the only one. Even when we look at that tiny fraction of people who do agree to be polled, there are a whole bunch of other weird psychological quirks that can mess with the results.
Let me just ask you this, straight up. In the world we live in today, how comfortable would you really be sharing your true, honest political opinions with a complete stranger who just called you out of the blue? Especially if you think your views might be a little controversial. For a lot of us, there's at least a little hesitation there.
And that feeling, that little hesitation, leads to a few other problems. There's social desirability bias, which is just a fancy way of saying we all want to look good, so we sometimes give the answer we think the pollster wants to hear. Then there's the shy voter theory, which is a version of that where people might not want to admit they support a candidate who's getting a lot of bad press. And then you have something really fascinating called mode effects.
This experiment from Pew Research just nails it. They asked a group of people a question with a live human interviewer. Do gays and lesbians face a lot of discrimination? 62% said yes. Then they asked a different but similar group the exact same question, but this time it was on a private, anonymous online survey. Only 48% said yes. That's a 14-point difference. The only thing that changed was whether they were talking to a person or just clicking a button online.
So, after all this, you might be thinking, okay, so polls are basically useless, right? Well, not exactly, but it does mean we have to get way smarter about how we read them.
So here's your new toolkit for reading a poll. First, always look beyond the headline number. The real story isn't the horse race. It's buried in the details about who they couldn't reach. Second, every time you see that little margin of error, make a mental note that it's hiding the much bigger total margin of error. And third, and this is the most important one, just embrace the uncertainty. Stop treating polls like they're crystal balls predicting the future. At best, they're a fuzzy snapshot of a range of possibilities.
And really, this all boils down to one big idea. Maybe we've had the whole purpose of polls wrong this whole time. A good poll isn't necessarily one that perfectly predicts the winner. A truly good, honest poll is one that's transparent about its own limits. It's one that's brave enough to tell you just how much it doesn't know.
So I'll just leave you with this. The next time a big poll flashes across your screen showing one candidate up by 3 points, what's your gut reaction going to be? Are you going to ask, is this right? Or are you going to ask the much smarter question? Just how uncertain is this?